All right, hi everyone. I'm Nicole Peterson, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for our SMA IIJO speaker session entitled Standing Under Stories, Narrative Research Methods for Anticipatory Intelligence. And I'd also like to thank today's speaker, Dr. Sarah Cobb, for taking the time to present today. So a few quick housekeeping items. We'll be having a virtual Q&A session at the conclusion of the brief. So during the brief or during the Q&A, feel free to submit your questions via the live event Q&A chat. It's a chat icon and it has two overlapping speech bubbles and one is a question mark. Also be sure to type your name and affiliation in before your question, or if you prefer for your name to not be recorded, go ahead and submit your questions anonymously. You can also vote on which questions you'd like to be addressed most by hitting the like button next to that question. So now I'm going to briefly introduce today's speaker before I turn the floor over to her. Dr. Sarah Cobb is the Drucci French Coombe Chair at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason University, where she was from 2001 to 2009, the Dean and Director. And in her current role as faculty, she teaches and conducts research on the relationship between narrative and conflict. She's also the Director of the Center for the Study of Narrative and Conflict Resolution at the Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution, where she provides a hub for scholarship on narrative approaches to conflict analysis and resolution. Finally, she's the co-editor of the journal Narrative and Conflict Explorations in Theory and Practice. So Dr. Cobb, I'm going to turn the floor over to you now.
It's a pleasure, and thank you so much, Nicole, and to SMA more broadly for the invitation. I look forward to engaging the community and sharing ideas. My talk today is really standing under, I would say, other people's work, right? And I'm going to review the body of literature that I'm drawing on today. But I would say for a start, can I have the second slide, Nicole, please? For a start, I'm interested in this notion of foresight and want to argue today that it can come through, or it needs to come through, this idea of reflexivity, that we need to be able to get to foresight in and through the processes of considering our own stories. So I'm building on the work of Lauren Kinney, who just completed her doctoral dissertation entitled Engaging with Uncertainty in Anticipatory Intelligence. So her work is seminal work. She's in the process of converting this to a book, and I'm really looking forward to it because I think it's absolutely groundbreaking work. And she cites Kerbel's concept of anticipatory intelligence and basically builds the argument in her work that we should be looking at narrative to do that, to develop anticipatory intelligence. So she's pointed in a really interesting direction, and I'm following her gaze, basically, with these comments. I'm going to argue here that this call to develop anticipatory intelligence and to see it derived from narrative is going to call, in turn, calls for our attention to reflexivity and to what other people have called the observing system. Can I have the third slide? So this is a picture of Heinz von Förster. He was a cybernetician, contributed mightily to that field. And in 1980s, and in fact, I think it was 1981 or two, he wrote a book called The Observing System. And it's where he argues that the first order of cybernetics is really the science of observed systems. And I would argue that the intelligence community has been about trying to make accurate observations of the field of operations, and for strategy purposes to make sense. And instead, what we should be doing is following the second cybernetics, which is really the science of the observing system, which is how are we making sense? So it's sort of taking the gaze off of the landscape itself and including ourselves in that landscape, basically. Can I have the fourth slide? And you see this in this diagram, which makes it very clear that at the center of the story, the center of the map or the diagram here is the observer. So the stories we tell derive from, our culture, our history, our understanding of the world are getting validated and reformulated in connection to and in relation to what we're observing and the kinds of distinctions we're making. So this is, both good news and bad news, I think, this notion of reflexivity for the intelligence community, because what it implies is we have to pay attention to our stories, which, in other words, our stories are shaping the environment that we're observing. And obviously the reverse is true. What the environment we're observing is shaping our stories, but I'm more concerned with the former rather than the latter in this presentation in particular. Can I have the 5th slide? So I wanted to share Hayden White with you today. He was a theorist, died shortly, not too long ago, seminal in the field of narrative studies. He wrote a book called The Content of the Form. He wrote another one called Meta-History. And basically what he argued was that if you're going to make sense of what happened or what is happening, the form of the story that you tell about that is the content. In other words, the content is driven by the form of the story that you tell, which was a radically fabulous idea when he came up with it. This book was published, Content of the Form was published in 1987. But I think it's not been, we haven't sort of wrung everything we could out of this. He came up with a series of 4 main emplotments, narrative emplotments, that histories fall into or descriptions fall into. And while I'm not going to review this rather detailed map that he provides, but I did want to use him to make an underlying point, which is that there is an underlying grammar to the stories that we tell, and that shapes, structures, organizes, and determines basically the content. So basically his message was the content is the form of the story that we're telling. So if that's the case, we'd better take a good hard look in the intelligence community at what we're seeing, because what we're trying to do is see into not just the world, we're trying to see into our own matrices, our own matrix, right, about the way in which we're shaping stories and how those are pre-structured according to other stories and traditions and histories that we bought into and carry with us as we go forward and make sense of the world. Now, Ryan McCoy she also did her dissertation at George Mason at our school. She wrote her dissertation entitled "A Critical Analysis of Intelligence Support to the Dayton Peace Agreement." She looked at the declassified documents in the intelligence community and found this fabulous findings that, in fact, much of the intelligence was scripted and organized by a set of stories derived from the West, sort of Western archetypal narratives that we have circulating in our culture, right, in the United States. And she names them, and I have 3 up here, right? But and these stories shaped what people saw happening on the ground. So it's a seminal piece of work, and I commend that to you. So what I wanted to do, are you on slide 7? Nicole?
We're on slide 7 now.
Yeah, please. I'm sorry. Well, let me go back to, can you go back to slide 6, please? So here I am clicking my slides and forgetting to tell you. This is a beautiful image here, going back to the idea that what we want to see is into our own matrix, not just what's happening in the world, but what's the code that's already embedded in the stories that we're telling that are shaping how we understand the world. So if you go to slide 7, you see reference to the work that Ryan McCoy has done, illuminating the way in which these Western stories shaped the intelligence that underlie the Dayton Peace Agreement. Very, very interesting. Can I have slide 8? So what I want to do here with you today is sort of a Goldilocks, let's say, analogy. I wanted to give you some different research methodologies to share them with you that would help us look at the deep structure of the stories that we're telling. What kind of narrative analytic tools can we bring to bear that help illuminate the stories that as observers, that we're using as observers. So I've got really 3 different categories here. Some of these narrative research methodologies are incredibly rigorous. Some are more normative and critical in nature. meaning they've got an embedded set of norms and standards there. And one is on genre theory, which is fabulously applicable. So this is the sort of Goldilocks solution that I wanted to share with you. Can I have slide 9? So the first one of these is, and this would definitely fall into the rigorous category, is my colleague Solon Simmons, also at the school for Carter School for Peace and Conflict Resolution at George Mason. And he's written a book last year called Root Narrative Theory. It's just totally excellent. And this is his diagram. I think it's on page 36 of his book. And basically, he posits that there are 4 main narratives, 4 root narratives that populate our culture and our recent history. And he's got a systematic way of discriminating, narratives from each other. So let me just lay out these 4 for you. He posits that the first one is, he calls a securitarian discourse, which arose as the states, any state, nation, in time became concerned about the mob, right? So what do you do about the mob? You defend, you increase stability, you support unity. And the purpose of that is to protect the state, right? And to make sure of its stability and its viability. And so that's a securitarian discourse. And you can see a lot of that emerging after 9/11, right? We were very, very concerned about our safety, basically. And so the protection of our state and the building up of our defense and our efforts to understand the enemy other multiplied, proliferated after 9/11. And you can, all that makes sense. The second discourse to emerge, really also, this is kind of a temporal thing. He probably wouldn't describe it that way, but it looks like that to me. And of course, the first the sectarian discourse might be exemplified by Thomas Hobbes. The second one exemplified by John Locke, where the problem was not, how to preserve the state. The problem was a powerful state and the maintenance of the liberty of the individual, right? The libertarian discourse, which is all about, the maintenance of, property and property, individual, the right to hold property, merit-based systems, and the consent of the individual to be part of that system. And you can see this in a lot of civil libertarian discourse today. A lot of libertarian responses, for instance, to the coronavirus, where people are saying, no, it's our right, our privilege to not wear a mask, for instance. That would be in a libertarian discourse. The third one is Karl Marx, exemplified by Karl Marx, and this is an egalitarian discourse that has to do with, making things equal, making sure everybody has the same access, making sure that goods are distributed fairly. It's about equity, right? So accountability and reciprocity are central here. And the last one is, the dignitarian discourse, which is exemplified by Frantz Fanon, which is really about, recognition of others and ensuring that people are included, and the effort to decolonize our understanding, to make sure that voices that have been suppressed or marginalized can be heard. So you can look around our world today and see these 4 discourses in operation. And I thought this might be a useful tool for anyone interested in assessing threat landscapes or increasing our intelligence or supporting our intelligence, to understand that these 4 discourses, not because we want to see just what the others are saying, but what are the stories that we're telling. And that's only interesting to the extent that you could know how you're being pre-structured because you're in a given discourse, you're in a given storyline. So that's a really interesting tool, I believe. A second one is, again, in the rigorous category. Another graduate of our program, John DeRosa, has just done wonderful work. He's written a book on his dissertation, and the book is entitled, can you go to slide 10? I'm sorry. The book is entitled Narrativized Strategic Choice. And he basically is arguing here, it's really interesting, that strategy, policy and military strategy, national strategy, is a function of the narrative components, and he identifies the 3 he thinks are pertinent: motives, perceptions, and preferences. And these can become indicators for changes in the evolving scenario. So this is a way to do the analysis, not only of the landscape and those other folks and what they're doing, but of our own stories around the sort of motives, perceptions, and preferences, and how ours are evolving over time, if they do. He did an analysis of the nuclear non-proliferation treaties with Russia, and showed how this kind of narrative analysis can aid in our understanding of the changes that took place as US and Russia were negotiating those treaties. Very interesting work. Now, can I have slide 11? The next narrative, the next research framework for understanding our stories comes out of critical narrative analysis, which, you know, I have contributed to that myself. And basically, what I think what this perspective affords is the analysis of the plot of the components of a narrative, would include plot, values, and characters. Now, this little gear I have here, this image, shows, because the character is the biggest image, it's the biggest gear in the drawing, it's the most important. In other words, how people are described, how they describe themselves, how they position themselves, and how they position others is a driver. It's a driver for the nature of the plot sequences, how we hook the story, how we hook the events together, and the nature of the values that we might espouse, right? We're going to espouse the values that undergird our own legitimacy, and in the case of a conflict, those values that delegitimize the other. So looking at this, one of the central points is narrative closure, right? So can I have slide 12? The biggest enemy I think we have in assessing landscapes for action, or building strategy, or developing our intelligence, the biggest hurdle for us is narrative closure. Because what is that? That is basically, can you go back to slide 11? That is basically a function of the way in which the characters, the plot, and the values all fit together, so that no light comes in there. Absolutely no light. And if you make any move to change those, you know, if someone comes along and tells you, oh, you've got the story wrong, it's more like this. How fast do we, as human beings, move to reorganize the elements of the story to produce a similar story? So they have, and stories are incredibly resilient. Can I have slide 12 again? Incredibly resilient. And what this closure does is, you know, narratives seal themselves off from alternative interpretations. It reduces our learning, you know, it confirms our biases, and basically it increases certainty. And we don't want certainty. We want the opposite of that. So the question is how to, particularly around our own narratives and how we're understanding the landscapes that we're part of and the stories we're telling about those landscapes. Can I have slide 13? So what this critical narrative analysis does is tell us how these component parts work together in either the production of conflict or its diminution, right? And what we know from research, we know that very simplistic constructions of characters, which is, you know, the good guy and the bad guy, the evil and the villain, and the victim protagonist, right? That's the hero. Those simple constructions are part of the problem, a significant part of the problem. They stall out our ability to engage others effectively. Also, we know from critical narrative analysis, the use of binary, very simplistic black and white value systems. You're either like this or you're like that. You know, it's good to be responsible. It's bad to be, lazy. Those two value systems, the simplicity of those value systems disables our ability to build more complex narratives, as does linear causality, where you've got a sequence of events that's lined up, generating a linear description of an event or a set of events that leads to an outcome. And that linear relationship disables us from seeing A, different events that we didn't include, or B, the way in which our own participation has contributed to that, to the lineup of those events. So this little diagram here is from a, complexity analysis, something like the work that Peter Coleman's done in conflict studies, that looks at the way in which we design these attractors, the role of attractors, meaning in any of these component parts of a narrative function as attractors. They draw in the stories related that let's say support those descriptions, generating very, very stable, deep wells in terms of the way in which the system operates. So this is a little visual that shows when you're at the bottom of that well, it takes a tremendous amount of energy to move to a different attractor that would change the way the system is operating. And the same thing is when you have these very, very simplistic narrative components, you're going to be in a deep well, and it's very, very hard to get out and generate uncertainty or new descriptions. So rather, what we should do for reducing conflict is have more complex constructions of the self and the other. We should be able to talk about the shadow sides, the things that are, a function of our strengths, but also bring with them, problems. And I like to give the example of myself when I'm teaching this, that, I'm incredibly intelligent. So I might say to anybody that asks me, oh, Sarah, tell us about yourself. And I said, well, I'm incredibly intelligent, right? I'm just so smart. But then, of course, the problem of being so smart is that you're likely not to hear or listen or appreciate the perspectives of others, right? I'm so quick to enjoy my own ideas, and I like them so much that I may not be the best team member. I may be a problem in a group team. So I have a shadow side, right? But we all have shadow sides. The nation has a shadow side. Countries have shadow sides. Groups have shadow sides. So anytime we position ourselves, and I'm talking about observer narratives about the other, these observer narratives could contain more complex descriptions of ourselves and of the other, which is equally important, as well as more complex value systems. You don't want binary value systems. You want what's multinodal value systems, where you've got lots of different ways to be right or wrong or good or bad, and more circular plot lines, which is these things happened, but in fact, we contributed to them in this following way. And the other people did this thing. And then, of course, because they did that, we did this. And you end up with something that looks more like a pile of spaghetti rather than a very clear linear story. Can I have, are you on slide 14, Nicole?
Yes.
Good. And did you just get on slide 14?
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh, sorry. So yeah, I was spouting off about how the critical narrative theory provides an instruction to us, a normative frame that says it's better if stories are more complex. And this little diagram here on the slide shows that, in fact, you want to make that well more shallow. You can get in and out of it easier if you've got more complexity in the stories that we're telling. You're likely to de-escalate conflict. Can I have slide 16? So now I wanted to tell you a little bit about some research that I've done on building on Gramius's work on grammars, right? So I did this research on narrative grammars, and he argues that and I was interested in narrative grammar because I'm trying to understand what are the deep structures that are organizing the stories that people are telling, particularly in conflicts. And he says that all grammars have both morphology and syntax. Morphologies are the units of meaning, and the syntax are the rules that govern and regulate these things. So those together constitute the narrative grammar. Can I have slide 16? So what we did is we took von Lang and Joymann's notion of a set of social moves, and then identified 6 of them that they see in negotiation all the time. People that are in negotiation are doing these moves all the time. And we could argue that negotiation is sort of a proxy for the kinds of conversations we might have, inside of the intelligence community or inside of, as we try to support the nation in our both in DOD and in the State Department. So we then deconstructed these social moves, these 6 moves. And we try to look for the characteristics of the plots and the characters and the value systems that were associated to each of these moves, we set up a prisoner's dilemma with a group of students. We audio and videotape them in groups negotiating, doing a prisoner's dilemma negotiation. And then afterwards, we asked them to storyboard the data. In other words, tell us the story of this negotiation and what happened. And these storyboards were depicted events that they found pertinent to the flow of the negotiation itself. And then we did an analysis of the syntax. And this is the 6 moves. Can you have slide 17, please? These are the 6 moves that they said. Basically, the ones in green here are those that contribute to conflict resolution or the evolution of conflict. And those that are in red are contributing to increasing conflict more than likely. And I can tell you what the findings are. So basically, you can see what we did here. We took these different moves and we simply laid out what kind of plots are associated to that move. And what are the value systems that we see associated to these different grammars, right? These syntaxes across the top, and what are the plots, characters, and values associated to them. And so using this chart, we did an analysis of the data, and here's the findings. We have we found out that there's a narrative, there's a path dependency for that structures interaction that unfolds given scenarios. And that grammar does this. The grammar that people use, this narrative grammar, has this path dependency. And once it gets rolling in a given direction, it's going to continue to roll in that direction. So for instance, the competition syntax evolved towards an individualism and aggression. And once it hit individualism and aggression, those 2 syntaxes, it didn't come back. So there was no instance where that narrative grammar could be suddenly transformed into a more collaborative grammar. However, parties that did frame competition as normal, that it's reasonable for us to have these differences, those ended up generating a move in the other direction towards collaboration and cooperation. The individualism syntax, once people ended up in an individualism syntax, which is, this is every person for themselves, and this is what I'm gonna take care of me, that's a gateway to aggression, to the next syntax. So, and people didn't get to aggression without passing through that individualism syntax. And once individualism, aggression emerge, there's no evolution towards cooperation thing. So that's a really interesting piece of research that, again, should be a cautionary tale for us. Now, the last thing I want to explore, and I've got a couple of minutes to do this. Can I have slide 19? Is something called genre research, which is super easy to apply and very, very interesting. It's ready-made for application. That's what I'm trying to say. And you have Samantha Hardy in her work on conflict research found that most conflicts are told in the genre of melodrama. So if you look across the different genres, tragedy, are you on slide 19? Yeah, you are. Tragedy, comedy, etc. The conflict is most often told in the frame of melodrama. And in that, you have a heroine, you have, some passive person that needs to be saved. They kind of don't have a voice, and you have to try to do things, mobilize to try to help them. There's a father, very paternalistic. They're going to fix the whole situation. There's a villain that's, absolute, like a zombie, absolute evil. And there's a hero, right? Somebody who's well-meaning. They kind of make some mistakes, but they're well-meaning. And if I did some analysis of President Obama's, some of his speeches, and found that, and he wasn't alone in this too, probably. I didn't happen to do President Bush's, but I probably would have found the same, where they position themselves as a father, right? In the melodramatic narrative about the other, the terrorist other, they're often told the story of terrorism in the frame of melodrama, positioning themselves as the father that's going to fix it. So, this is a problem. Can I have slide 20? So what we see is that when you have these characteristics, and this is a slide from Samantha Hardy's paper on this. When you tell a story in a melodramatic form, you're going to increase conflict and shut down the opportunities for the evolution or transformation of conflict. And she recommends instead, her research showed that when stories were told in a tragic format, they were much more likely to have developed relationships. You're much more likely to have options for new solutions. You're much more likely to have agency on the part of people. They feel like they can do things, right? And so the features of these tragic narratives include, you have to have very complex characters. You're on slide 20, correct, Nicole? I hope.
Yes, I am.
Yeah. You've got more, you're looking at why characters are doing things, not just their actions. You're acknowledging the conflicting imperatives, right? Different solutions, and you're trying to work towards some mutual contributions. You've got very active protagonists capable of self-determination rather than people who are passively impacted by everything and unable to be agents. You're focused on the future, embracing change, and conflict is basically an opportunity. So this tragic format, we've got research that shows it's more productive and better, I would argue, than a melodramatic form. Now, all of this is, can I have last slide, 21? All of this, my final comments are really to sum up. I would say that, we want to think about our own stories, because if we're going to have foresight, if we're going to try to understand the future, we have to understand the way our stories are shaping that future, and look at our root grammars and the way in which we formulate a strategic choice, and increase the complexity of our plot lines and design more tragic, and avoid the melodramatic narratives. So all of this is a way of saying that, that I believe that the attention to our own stories is every bit as important, because the real tragedy would be, I would say, as a citizen that loves my country, is to have us tell these stories that produce outcomes, in which we unwittingly produce outcomes that are going to be against our interests and against our intentions. So thank you very much. And can I slide down the next slide, the last slide? Let's see that. Don't I have a bibliography? Can I say 22, and I'll just leave it there. People look at the bibliography. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. So now we're going to go ahead to the Q&A portion of the team session. So make sure to keep submitting your questions through the Q&A chat as we continue the discussion. So Dr. Cobb, I have a clarifying question for you to start. And that question is, are these narratives Western narratives, or are they universal? And this question is from Lauren Zimmerman from NCIT.
Right, that's a really good question. I think that we've got really good data that shows narratives are universal. They are ubiquitous. We are storytelling creatures across all cultures, and they might be done differently. They're performed differently. They might have different ways of appearing, but they are narratives. They have beginning, a middle, and an end. They have plots of characters and value systems, and they produce, functionally, they produce a positionality for the speaker while the speaker positions others. Now, the way in which you might position someone in a Eastern culture would be different than the way in which you might position someone in a Western culture, a lot more indirect, etc. So I don't think that I'm talking about just Western narratives. I think I'm talking about the deep structure of narratives and the way in which they operate. Now, I haven't done the cross-cultural work to see, Sol and Simmons' research, for instance, on root narratives. One could argue that that's Western history. And it's useful and interesting. And I think we can look at root narratives and see from other cultures and see, are they different? Do we have to multiply the categories, which more likely we do? So, but I do think there is a deep structure, just like we've got Chomsky and others have noted, there is a deep structure to language. Well, there's a deep structure to narrative. And I think that's one of the things I've been trying to point in the direction of. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. And we'll go ahead with another clarifying question before we head into the meat of the Q&A. And this question is, can you clarify what a circular plot line is?
Can I clarify what?
What a circular plot line is.
Yeah, linear plot lines would lay out a series of events, each one logically causing the next one, right? Leading to an outcome. And in the case of a conflict, it's a bad outcome. So a protagonist will tell a story about, look at all the things that happened and led to this terrible outcome. That's a linear narrative. A circular narrative would look like, well, this kinds of things happened, and then I did this, trying to do that. But then these other people thought of this. They thought it was like this, so they did this thing over here. And then and then because of that I did this, and because of this I did that. So when the difference between a circular and linear narrative is the inclusion of the actions of the protagonist that generate the circumstances that then they're trying to address and alleviate or improve, right? So I think a circular plot line tells a story of the interdependence of the parties involved and the way in which they have interdependently together constructed a given outcome. I hope that's helpful.
Perfect, thank you. All right, so now into the meat of the Q&A. Our first question is from Kirk Otterson from Los Alamos National Lab.
Mm-hmm.
And he asks, how has complexity theory, if it has, sorry, let me restate this. How has complexity theory, an understanding of complex adaptive systems like nonlinearity, emergent behaviors, et cetera, informed your thinking on conflict narratives, if it has?
It has, and I've written a paper on this, sir, and I didn't get it, I haven't gotten it published, but I really was working off of the work of Peter Coleman, who I commend to everybody. He's written a series of actually 3 papers that are a set. I think it's in the journal Peace and Change. I can get that for the community if they're interested. And this was probably, I don't know, 5 years or so ago, they started appearing, these papers from Peter and his team. And they argued that, they were talking about conflict, intractable conflict as systems, right? As complex systems, and what that meant in terms of emergence and transformation. I felt that their work did not take seriously, or didn't peer into, let's say, it's not that they were dismissive, they just didn't look to see the way in which conflict itself is structuring the interactions. Now, I've been interested in emergence in terms of language. How do we emerge new language? How do we develop new descriptions for a long time? And I commend you to the work of Mark Turner. He's written on something called narrative compression, which is how we shingle, again, to use a metaphor that David Laws and some other people in conflict studies have done. How do we shingle meanings on top of each other in ways that would alter the frames and develop new descriptions that would give people more options for resolving conflicts. So I've been very influenced by it. I think that I myself have a lot to do to interrogate the implications of complexity theory for narrative. But I do think we could begin to talk about the emergence of new stories and actually look for the science of how that's happening. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. Our next question is from Mr. Chad Veazey, the director of SMA. And his question is, I think that the emphasis on our narrative and matrix is very well placed and underserved in our government and the IC. It would seem that a similar analysis of our competitors' narratives and the matrix is equally important as we consider these two competing narratives in an interactive and complex whole. What are your thoughts on this?
Yes, I think that's absolutely the case. And I think whatever we can do to interrogate others, the people with whom we're negotiating or struggling or in conflict, to try to understand their narratives thoroughly, for me goes without saying. And I totally agree with that. I think it'd be really interesting to start to look at, for instance, and Solon Simmons has done this in the application of root narrative theory, looked at competing groups that are in conflict and sees, one group is in a sectarian discourse and the other is in a dignitarian discourse, where one folks are talking about protecting the state and having a strong defense, and the other folks are talking about that might be the police and their description of their obligations to protect the public, right? And then you have groups like Black Lives Matter talking about respect and honoring the marginal voices and ensuring that they've got the privilege to be recognized by others, et cetera. So what do you do with those? So knowing those differences, I think, is really interesting. The question then is, because we can't speak for them, whatever side you're on, you can't speak for the others, right? You can only speak for yourself. So my emphasis is to try to say, we have the opportunity to be agents of change. Maybe we can't change the stories others are telling. Knowing what they are and understanding them is great, but we sure have an opportunity to alter the nature of the interaction by by altering the stories or by complexifying the stories we're telling. And I think the stories we're telling about the others, so that oftentimes our stories about the others may be, let's say, characterized by melodrama, and that would be a problem. So not only our stories about ourselves, but our stories about the others as well. And understanding their stories. So I'm agreeing with you. I'm just putting the accent on the syllable of the observer for today. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. Another question related to an other is we have a question from Dr. Bob Elder from George Mason also. And his question is, he's a good friend of SMA. So his question is, as you look at China and Russia, how would you describe their narratives and how should we respond, we being the US?
Well, I'm looking at that in the Arctic, Bob. So I've got a project, a National Science Foundation project on conflict in the Arctic, right? And I'm trying to understand the nature of that. And I've talked to some experts on this, and I'm not an expert on Russia and China. So, but I'm curious. I'm very curious. So, and we've read. I've got I can share also with the group. Maybe I can't. Well, let me say. I have a group with John DeRosa and Christine Rosenfeld from Christine's from George Mason, and John DeRosa, who's coming back, I think, as an Army fellow to Washington, D.C. from SOCOM. And he's one that wrote narrativized strategies. And I have a project with them. We've done an analysis of all the policy documents for the Arctic Council using John's methodology of trying to understand the components of strategy from a narrative lens. And, China is positioning itself. So I'm only going to speak about what I know around China and Russia from the context of the Arctic, where I've been looking at these policy documents. And China is positioning itself as a near Arctic state. And they're very concerned that the changes in the Arctic are going to privilege some characters and not others, and they're going to build the road, right, the Belt Road through the Arctic, through the ocean. They're going to include that. So I think they're my sense, without being an expert on China at all, is that it's a narrative of being left out. It's a narrative of wanting in before the door closes and they get left out or pushed out. So they're framing themselves as highly interested in research for all nations that aren't Arctic nations, all the other what's called observer nations in the Arctic Council, use research as the entry door to legitimize their presence in the Arctic. So I think they want to be present, and it's not lost on anybody, and I'm sure not on China, that they are concerned about the presence of the increased shipping in the community. The fact that all the shipping is going to be going over the globe rather than around the globe as the ice melts, it's going to present incredible economic opportunities. And right now, I talked to a woman who was an expert, and she is Russian. She doesn't speak for the Russian government, but I did an interview with her, and she was talking about the way in which all the boats that are coming up along the Russian coast now, that are going into the Arctic, through the Arctic, are Chinese. So they're not at all sure, from a Russian standpoint, that in fact they're the melting of the ice in the ocean is going to increase opportunities for Russia. Although she did tell me that that's the basic storyline that's circulating in the communities, at least in the coastal communities, that this is going to be a gravy train, a gold mine, a gold rush, basically, for opportunities. So I haven't really answered your question because I'm not an expert on those things, but I do think interrogating other nations' stories, not by, I'm going to go out on a limb, not by only reading the policy documents, but by imagining, right? Imagining. And maybe that's what also another way of foresight, another meaning of foresight is to not just go on the data you've got, but to imagine yourself, imagine into the world that people are occupying, to try to see what it is that they care about and why. So I don't think I have as and other people I know, I won't mention names, have told me that Russia is not near the threat that, let's say, just as an individual reading the papers, I might surmise, given the size of its economy and given its, its real interests, what its interests are, which is the preservation of its own state and the construction of its own economic security, right? So, but sorry for rambling there. I wish I could talk to people. I wish this wasn't a one-way street, so I could get a little feedback there on that. Kind of a lame answer there.
We'll get to that point eventually.
Thanks.
Where we can interact face-to-face again. Our next question is from Julie M. from Stratcom, and she asks, if there's a history between actors whose grammar and syntax have evolved to aggression, is there a way to shift out of that narrative? And can a shift in narrative and framing of the differing national interests nudge the dialogue or the story back towards cooperation?
My data would suggest no, but my heart says yes. I think it must be the case that we, I can't give up my whole life's work thinking that once it goes to aggression, that's it. I do think that's where the observer narrative gets really important, because real power, in my view, is in not just responding to others, but shaping the nature of the interaction we have with them, right? Through the stories we tell. So I think it'd be possible for, and again, not something that I can imagine people in the intelligence community or DoD would want to do. I think it'd be possible to look at any quote unquote adversary that we have, where the United States has, where we're struggling to build a more collaborative future and to reduce violence. I think it'd be possible to engage them with a very, very serious conversation about what they want, why they want it, and how they came to want that, and when did they first notice that they wanted that, and why couldn't they have it in the past, and what would this do for in the future. And my own experience, which is limited, is that at the international level I'm talking about, or as a speaker for the United States, which I've never done, haven't held a public office like that. But my experience, based on, for instance, being in war games, is that the United States has been, that the players that are the US players have a very fixed notion about what should be the US response to things. So for instance, when a pariah nation goes through a transition and has a transitional government, comes forward to the US players and said, hey, we really want to, we're so excited. We really want to change our position in the world, and we want to be, part of the good guys and with the international players, and we're excited about playing a new role. The response of the U.S. in that particular war game was to tell people, no, not yet. We're not going to lift the sanctions. No, you're not ready. Nope. Which was devastating. And of course, it generated all kinds of faction creation on the part of inside of that transitional government for the host nation. And they ended up with a coup, and bad guys came into power again. And that was directly related to the fact that the United States could have said, maybe they would have kept the sanctions, but maybe they could have said things like, you guys are fabulous. Wow, this is a new day. We're really thrilled. But there was no affirmation. There was no legitimacy put on that. So that could have, let's say, shingled on top of a little bit of sugar with some medicine, right? Around, we got to keep the sanctions, but here's what we think is going to happen, and we're so happy to partner with you on this. So that would be an example of why I think it's possible to make these moves away from aggression, but it's going to require us to be a lot more sensitive to the way in which we position others delegitimately as delegitimate, and then get the blowback from that. So yes, we have to do our part, I guess. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb, and thank you, Julie, for the question.
Yeah, good question.
So before we proceed, I want to quickly highlight an answer or a comment in the Q&A chat from Lauren Kinney. And Lauren Kinney was a previous student of Dr. Cobb's, and she has done a lot of the research on which Dr. Cobb was discussing, or a good amount of it. So she wants to build on Kurt Gotterson's question about complexity science. She says, Dr. Cobb briefly mentioned my work at the beginning of the presentation. Josh Kerbel has done a lot of work on using complexity science and anticipatory intelligence. I tried to build on some of his ideas, but make a case specifically for the ways that complexity science can help us understand what I call the social dimension of complex systems. That is the dynamics of interaction and the way that communication is better understood as a circular, think about feedback loops, which coincides with the circular plot lines that Dr. Cobb was talking about. So I just wanted to highlight that answer real quick.
Yeah, I think Lauren's going to break all this open with her work. I think, again, Josh Kerbel pointed us in a really fabulous direction around anticipatory intelligence. I think it's just a really interesting, fabulous idea, and meets up with some other literatures from, for instance, scenario building, et cetera. But I think Lauren's, Josh pointed Lauren in that direction, and Lauren Kinney and her research is now going to really open up the intersection of complexity theory to narrative and anticipatory intelligence. And I can't wait for her book to come out.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb, and thank you, Lauren Kinney, for providing feedback in the chat. All right, so our next question is, how is this narrative analysis useful for counter disinformation?
That's a good question. I've thought a lot about that recently because of the world we're living in right now with this, after January 6th and the attack on the Capitol. I've been thinking a lot about disinformation and what do you do about it. We, just today, Mitch McConnell has said, or yesterday, called this sort of disinformation campaigns to be a cancer on the Republican Party. So what do we do about it? I mean, it seems to me that one of the things is that these disinformation, let's say, may be motivated by different experiences. So on the one side, you could, disinformation probably is promulgating the self-interest of the people who are putting it out, and they're trying to improve their economic, circumstances or whatever. But I think a lot of the things that are going on today with disinformation are not about the economics. They're not about sort of self-interest. They're more about they come out of a position, a stance in the world and an experience of that world that we could interrogate. So I think the solution to disinformation is not just, blocking platforms and, making rules and laws against people, the stories that people are telling, but more a responsiveness and openness, a curiosity to why people are telling those stories and why is it important to them. But sort of getting past the information, the disinformation itself, to the storytellers, to the people themselves and what their experience is. And I think that's one of the things we need to do in this country, to actually reduce the polarization. So I don't have an answer about what to do on the spot with disinformation, except to, develop strategies, and I think we need them immediately, if not yesterday, for engaging communities that are feeding off that disinformation.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. That question came up in the Q&A chat a few times. So thank you for your answer to that.
Yeah.
Okay, so our next question is from Chris M. And he asks, can you comment on the concept of the battle for the narrative and whether there's a better or more appropriate way for which to frame this thought for leaders? Or is this a realistic way in which to frame these types of discussions?
No, I'm not a fan of the battle of the narrative at all as a frame. It may make sense to people depending on where they're situated in sort of the federal government, that because they feel it is a battle, it's either their story or somebody else's is going to win the day. And John DeRosa has been quite vocal on this topic as well. In fact, he organized a conference that we had at the school on the battle of the narrative, right? And we talked explicitly about what that frame does to the interaction and to our way of engaging others. So I remember in looking at some military documents and and I was excited when the U.S. military got interested in narrative, because I thought, wow, we're really going to be able to make a difference here. Not as happy about the framing of it as the battle of the narrative, but I did think it was useful for leaders on the military side or the civilian side to begin to see the way in which the narrative shapes our stories, or the stories are shaping the theater of operations, so to speak. The place where we're trying to the places where we're trying to work. So I think in terms of what's a better frame, I argued at the time, and I still do, that I think a better frame is engaging narratives. We need to be engaging, not battling them, because when you battle narrative, all it does is close up. And so we try to give more counter narratives, and we've got good research that shows counter narrative is not a strategy for opening a narrative to change. But there's one thing that can be done that does open narratives, and that is legitimacy. So finding ways of signaling regard, concern, interest, curiosity about others is a way of opening those stories, and going back to the prior questions about, how do you move away from aggression, reducing conflict scenarios and de-escalating. So I like the frame of engaging narratives better than battling them. Thank you for the question.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. So we have about 11 more questions, and I just want to double check. Would you be able to stay on for 15 extra minutes to address these questions, or do you have a hard stop?
Nope, I'm fine.
Okay, great. All right, so for our audience's notice, we will be staying on for extra time to go ahead and address some of these remaining questions. Our next question is from Oren from the Army, and the question is, do you have any suggestions for how to empower leaders who are certainty-oriented and find discomfort in the idea of striving for uncertainty?
Yeah, that's such a great question, because, it's turtles all the way down, right? So, we might know that if we change our narratives as observers, we can do things, but then we're working with, very heavy institutions and traditions that make it very difficult to do that. So I think that, introducing leaders to narrative is a great idea, because we talk about it in the folk sense all the time, right? Everybody's talking about the narrative now, and our narratives, and what do we do with our narratives and et cetera. But the folk concept isn't enough, not just that we tell stories, but what's the apparatus? How does a narrative work? And what is the apparatus surrounding that? And we've got a new program at our school on bipartisan training for political leaders. I think it's a course, that has a series of lectures and seminars. So we're trying this out, and I'm anchoring the one on narrative that we're providing for the political leaders that have signed up for this. But at this point we have 30 people, and it's doesn't include very high up leaders in Congress or anything like that. So we're making some baby steps, but I think we could design a program that would be really fabulous for the leaders in our intelligence community. And I know that many people have done that. I know that the work of the National Center for Counterterrorism, we've got lots of experts over there that have been thinking about narrative and the components. Whether or not those rise to the level of the leaders, how do we engage the leaders is another question. But we have to have a driver's license to drive a car, but as we know, there's no license to have a child or become a political leader. So we do the best we can, I guess. But that's a really good question. But I think we could design curriculum. That's how I would do it. Of course, I'm a teacher, so that's going to be my response. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. Our next question is, narratives occur within a kind of evolutionary landscape. Some narratives seem fitter than others. Current fitness functions seem to select for simple narratives, much the way that people prefer to read tight, easy to consume science headlines versus understanding the actual messiness of what the science actually says.
Right.
How can we change the fitness function so that complex narratives, harder to consume, harder to convey, may increase uncertainty, can actually outcompete simpler narratives that are easier to consume, spread, and reduce uncertainty?
Well, that's just a brilliant question. All of these questions are so smart, and you know, I want to be on the team of all of you all who are working on this or thinking about it. As I really applaud the depth of your insights into what the issues are, and on all the issues you've raised have been, you know, sort of different facets of this set of problems around implementing anything like this. So relative to the fitness, you know, question, how do we do that? One answer would be journalists, right? So we consume a lot of narratives that are told by journalists, and I've been interested in a program for journalists for a long time. And I actually had a journalist call me the last year, I guess it was, and ask for some insights into what narrative has to offer journalism's the way we tell the stories and how they would tell their stories. So I think that's one avenue. Given the fact that we all want sound bites, you know, we're all scrolling through the Twitter and TikTok, and it's 100, maybe now more than 140 characters for Twitter, but it's still really small. I think we're going to have to choose our venues, right? And sometimes I would add, it only takes a word. It doesn't take 15 pages to tell a complicated story, a more complex story, let's say. And then because the complexity increases even if you introduce a phrase that wasn't anticipated by your audience, right? And it could be something like, you know, if I'm on the side, let's say I'm on the side of supporting the research for climate change, and I'm against oil. By the way, I have a climate scientist daughter and another daughter that was an oil executive. Our Thanksgiving dinners were really interesting. And sometimes it only takes an introduction of a word or a phrase. So had my daughter, the climate scientist, ever said to the other one, had she ever said, look, you know, I think it's really interesting that that you all have produced, you know, gravity drainage as a strategy for emptying the wells, right? And I wonder how you're managing that from an environmental perspective. What are the concerns that BP has about that? I sort of outed her there with the company, but because they did have concerns. It's just that my daughter, the climate scientist, never thought about anybody having concerns. So it wouldn't have taken much to change that dynamic of interaction if my daughter had asked a question about what were their internal concerns about the environmental issues and how were they managing to address those. So my BP daughter could never get, the oil executive could never get a word in edgewise with the climate daughter around these issues because of all the preconceived notions on the side of the climate science advocate, right? So I guess my answer to you is how are we going to change this, you know, one interaction at a time, slow. I don't basically have a good answer to your question, but you maybe you're going to come up with an answer.
That's okay. Thank you. All right. I wanted to highlight another note from Lauren Kinney in the chat. And this comments on Chris M's question about the battle of the narrative.
Right.
So she states, Dr. Cobb was the lead editor or the lead author of a 2016 SMA paper that talks more extensively about what constitutes what she just mentioned in terms of narrative engagement and how it actually works as an alternative and counterintuitive approach to traditional forms of counter messaging. And she says it's a brilliant paper and something that I drew upon heavily in my research.
Yeah, but you know, as we know that Lauren's really taking the work beyond that. So I'm glad to share that paper, and I do think I'd forgotten about that paper, Lauren. You're right. It's an interesting paper because it's sort of set up tasks. It's set up a framework for information operations from this perspective of narrative, not just as a folk concept, but as a technical theoretical frame. So thank you for mentioning that. And again, I think Lauren's work has gone well beyond anything that I've imagined yet. And I'm so, again, looking forward to the publications of the work. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. And thank you, Lauren. Our next question is, you highlight the importance of grammar in shaping the narrative. Do you think that autonomous systems like machine learning or AI will ever have the fidelity to operate in a multilingual environment to shape the narrative with low attribution and not exposing themselves?
Yes, yes. And the reason I would say yes is because, we have bots now that are doing that. We have bots that are fomenting division, and polarization. They already understand the language of divisiveness, of conflict. So yes, that's going to be possible. I do think the imaginative, creative side, and I think this is what your question alludes to, is really important. But you could imagine. I mean, I'm not a computer coder, or I'm not a computer scientist by any stretch of the imagination, but I do think it's possible to figure out affinities between words, and you could actually map the connotative field of meaning pretty clearly. And there's a new coding tool, Lexomancer, and I just was playing with it yesterday. And what it does is give you all the words that are associated to a given node, right, around that you put in a piece of discourse, and you get this sort of display. Well, all you need to do to get machines to be imaginative would be to help them understand the network, and where there could be overlapping, basically new terms connected to each other that haven't. That's what poetry is, right? Poetry is simply putting words together in a way that we haven't imagined before. And I think we could get machines to do poetry, and if they can do that, they can design responses that would de-escalate, probably better than human beings if they're programmed to do it. Lots of times we don't want it. We might know what to do, but we don't want to do it because we're in conflict with others. So very good question. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. Another interesting one here is from John Hanley from the Naval War College. Mm-hmm. And he asks, games have a history of improving communication. Have you looked at games with different how games with different stakeholders affect narratives?
Yes, and that's what I have, just a very minimal experience with war games, but I think it's a fabulous venue, and I think it's a brilliant idea, because going back to the other question about what do we do for leaders, right? What do we do about leaders and their understanding of narratives and their role in narrative production? Well, that's something you can really learn in the game. So I think we could design for this. Set up, what Peter Perla, one of the main authors or sort of founders of the modern wargaming world. He talked about story living, right? That games set up the conditions for story living, and I think we could do that very much so, and to help design the scenarios where people are experimenting with new ways of describing things, new kinds of information that they're getting in and articulating and storying differently. So we could set up games for restorying, for sure. And we have John DeRosa and I are going to we're going to run a workshop. That's what it's going to be in March with the wargaming group out of Georgetown, with Sebastian Bay. And we're trying now to figure out what are we going to do, because we're interested in just that, trying to get the group to help us think about a game that could be played by leaders who are interested in the Arctic. So we would set this up as a game around the Arctic, and then support the learning and growth of the participants, evolving their own stories about the Arctic while they're in the game. So thank you so much for that. It's a great idea.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. Mm-hmm. The next question is, how does consensus develop around a specific narrative, even by those who did not directly experience the events around that narrative?
So, clearly one is repetition, right? But repetition alone isn't enough. We know that. I think that there's this is such a complicated question. It's such a great question, but first place, I'm not sure there's ever real consensus, right? We have to stop and think that it could well be what we take as consensus, meaning, because it means to make sense with. That's what it means, right? That if you scratch the surface on any given area where you think there's consensus, you see all kinds of different stories, positions or frames are anchored in different kinds of histories and different sorts of logics and different aspirations, right? Different dreams and different concerns. So I'm not ever sure how much consensus there is over anything. But to the extent that we do begin to tell a common or a shared narrative, and you could watch that happen around the Capitol, right? The attack on the Capitol on the 6th, right? I don't know where you all were, but I was watching that day the Congress deliberate around the certification of the election. I was watching it when it happened. I couldn't make sense of it. I couldn't figure it out. I didn't know what was happening. I couldn't figure, why were the people in the Capitol like that? And of course, if you look between that and even one day later, where we had the word insurrection laid down in the newspapers, in the chat rooms, everywhere, everybody was talking about an insurrection. And I was curious at that time, what would be other ways of describing that? I felt myself sort of resisting that language, not because I was in favor of what people did when they attacked the Capitol, but more because I felt insurrection was a word that described it that was very, very, very much aligned with one perspective, with a given perspective. And I wondered how so many other people in the country would story that, and how they would define it as a protest, and why would they do that. So I watched the consensus emerge, but I'll tell you what happened is all those other ways of describing it were cut off. The newspapers didn't report it that way. The media didn't talk about it that way. So I think that's a bad thing myself, not because I'm in favor of the attack on the Capitol again, but because I do think that the multiplicity and the complexity of how we describe things is a way to keep us uncertain and keep open the possibilities that are foreclosed, basically, through narrative closure. So, thank you. Great question.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. So it looks like we have a chance to address one more question before we adjourn today. So this question is, are there libraries of templates of stories that each culture has that influence their tendency towards simple or complex stories?
I don't know of any. I don't know of any. I do know that there have been studies done, for instance, by a famous linguist, Vladimir Propp, who wrote a book in 1920 called The Morphology of Folktales. And he studied folktales around the world. And he came up with, there's 33 core functions of folktales. And here they are. So you can see that there's a deep structure to folktales from that. But does that apply to, what are the deep structures in circulation, for instance, in the news media in different countries around the world? I don't have any way of knowing that. I don't know of any studies that have been done on that. I do think there's a book called Narrative Landmines that's really interesting. I can't remember the author right now off the top of my head. Sorry. And this book lays out rumor and how rumor works, and the way it's destructive to, what problem it poses, let's say, for any institution that wants to build trust with the public. This can be destroyed in a matter of moments right now with social media. So that's a really interesting book, and that book shows that rumor has a similar form and plays a similar function around the world. So there may be some things that are crossing cultures that we need to pay attention to, and that's one that comes to mind. But again, we've got a lot more to do to try to excavate answers to these excellent questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Cobb. Unfortunately, that's all the time that we have for today. If you asked a question that wasn't addressed, that we didn't have time to address today, feel free to send me an email and I'll pass those along to Dr. Cobb. But
Sure.
otherwise,
Sure.
thank you so much, Dr. Cobb, for such a fascinating brief and for all of your time today.
Well, I want to also thank again Lauren Kinney, whose inspiration this has come from her work and from Josh Kerbel's work as well. So there's a lot of good people out there doing interesting things, and it's wonderful to be part of this kind of community. Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for tuning in today, and have a great day.
Thank you.